Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our discussions, Wartime Documentation, Literature, Memoirs, and Testimonies. We are ready to start after a brief announcement about our fundraiser effort. And this effort will be introduced by Nadia Kapitula, the alumna of the National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy.
So, hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Kapitula, and today I represent our friend and alumna of KMA, Timur Plush. He is now serving in the army in the 24th Brigade on the Donetsk region. And to comply with his duties on the front line, their brigade needs a quadricycle. So I kindly ask you to help with the promotion, with some with the funding for this quadricycle, so we can help a bit to our soldiers, to our alumni, and Ukraine overall. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadia. And we're having a short video for you. This is appeal by Timur for our community. Yeah, please.
Шановні викладачі та співробітники наукма, дорогі студенти та випускники, люба могилянська родина. Я, Тимур Плющ, колишній студент факультету економічних наук Національного університету Києво-Могилянська Академія, а тепер військовослужбовець 24-ї окремої механізованої бригади імені короля Данила, яка виконує свої задачі на Горлівському напрямку. І зараз я відчуваю, що мені надзвичайно не вистачає багатьох елементів нашої спільноти, інтелектуального середовища, палких академічних дискусій, затишних посиденьок в бібліотеці, підготовки до семінарів з друзями, атмосфери подолу і відчуття золотої свободи, аурум лібертас. Але, на жаль, найбільше мені не вистачає квадроцикла для виконання бойових завдань. Тому я щиро прошу всю спільноту підтримати наш могилянський збір на квадроцикл CF Moto. І вірю, що ми ще неодмінно зустрінемося в наших стінах. Разом до перемоги, слава Україні і частинний Києво-Могилянська Академія вічна.
Thank you. And the details of the card number you can see in our in the comments to our stream, and also in Zoom. And my honor and pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Kateryna Zarembo. Kateryna Zarembo, PhD, is a non-resident fellow at Central European University, Vienna, Austria, and an associate senior fellow at the New Europe Center, Kyiv, Ukraine. Throughout her career, she has combined academic research, policy analysis, and writing. Her latest non-fiction book, The Rise of the Ukrainian Sun, The History of Donetsk and Luhansk at the beginning of the 21st century, is dedicated to civil society movements in Ukraine's east before the Russian invasion of 2014. The book was shortlisted for BBC Ukraine's Book of the Year 2023, the KBU Awards 2023, and the Yuri Shuvalova Prize the same year. Dr. Zarembo is a recipient of a number of scholarships and awards, including the Emma Goldman Snowball Award and the Kyiv School of Economics Talents for Ukraine Award. She has published widely in academic and policy outlets, including European Societies, European Security, the Problems of Post-Communism, as well as with the New Europe Center and Carnegie Europe. Welcome, Kateryna, and our speakers, and enjoy the discussion.
Good evening, dear audience. Good evening to those who are here present with us and who are watching us online and who will watch us on the record. Today, I am extremely honored to moderate the panel of the second day of the conference, Wartime Documentation, Literature, Memoirs, and Testimonies. And I'm also very happy and privileged to say that this is an all-female panel, a rare thing. Yeah? And I would like to, without further ado, to give floor to each speaker. I would like to emphasize that we have 20 minutes max, so I will observe the time and I will make you signs, for your presentations. We will have a short break in between our third and fourth presenter. Yaryna Chornohuz will join us a bit later. She's a service person of the Ukrainian military and she's delayed by her duties today, but she will join us later. So we will have a short break and the discussion Q&A and your comments will also be able to make in the very end of this panel. So please save them and make notes. And of course, please feel free to donate and share our link for fundraiser for 24th Brigade named after King Danilo. I would first like to give the floor to Mariia Shuvalova, my dear colleague and co-organizer of this conference. Mariia Shuvalova is a PhD candidate at the National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy. She runs the Ukrainian Open Access Translation Series at Academic Studies Press. She is a co-founder of the new Ukrainian Academic Community NGO and was a Fulbright Scholar at Columbia University. Actually, is a Fulbright Scholar. There are no former Fulbrights, right? Her recent publications include First Go Novels, Then Go Tanks, Contemporary Russian Military Fiction over the time frame of 2009 to 2022, and Ukrainian Literature About the War, the time frame 2015 to 2022 again, in the volume entitled Russia's War in Ukraine, published in 2022 by Ibidem Press and Columbia University Press jointly, and edited by Tamara Marcinyuk and Tatiana Kostachenko. Mariia will deliver her presentation on the topic Ukrainian fiction about the full-scale invasion, reshaping memory, literary theory, and the future. Mariia, the floor is yours.
Kateryna, thank you so much for such kind introduction. Colleagues, friends, it's a pleasure to be here today. As I began my morning in 3:40 a.m. because of pretty loud explosion, I will still try to deliver this presentation as energetically as possible. So I will start with short notes that Ukrainian scholars and people who work in Ukrainian studies, we have been observing how war transforming what we know about literature and us as human beings, like more than 10 years. Here I mean simultaneous wars, the current wars that happening right now. And I adjusted my presentation a bit just to give you a glimpse that despite this conference is so on agenda and war is so on agenda, a huge amount of work was done by Ukrainian scholars and there is tradition and perspective. And also I prepared some shocking quotes just to intrigue you and encourage to immerse yourself in this field. So I will start with very provoking quote from the novel. Year 2010, having provoked riots, the Orange Nazis unleashed a civil war in Ukraine with the help of peacekeeping continent, of NATO, and under cover of American aviation. We're still waiting for American aviation. And armored vehicles, Western Ukrainian punishers with a trident on their shoulders start exterminating Russian-speaking population, erasing entire cities from the face of the earth. Poltava perishes in a fire. Dnipropetrovsk is destroyed. Towns on the left bank of Dnipro, Crimea and Novorossiya are rising against invaders. Russia is helping the resistance fighters with the latest weapons, volunteers, and military advisors. They will break fucking Bandera Trident. So you may ask, what was that? And actually, it's a short description by George Savitsky novel, published in 2008. And this book is called The Battlefield is Ukraine, Broken Titan. And it's just a short illustration. Then in Russian literature, books about first coming invasion of Russia on Ukraine, as well as annexation of Crimea, annexation of Donetsk and Lugansk region, as well as full-scale invasion of Kiev, as we have such fiction titled Pilots of Novorossiya, Siege of Kiev, also published. So there is also a full-scale invasion of Kiev. A fiction like that started appearing since 2008. So much earlier than the actual war began. I believe this research on such literature was my first introduction how fiction and art and literature can be deployed in order to justify crimes, invasions, and also that changed my perception of literature. You may say that maybe this fiction that was written in Russian and have never been translated in other languages by obvious reasons, it was only books for internal use for Russian citizens. Though here I would like to mention that using literature in this way, producing huge amount of fiction about aggression, and I believe that the main poetic feature in these novels was a hate speech. I have never thought that the hate speech can be like main feature of Poetic, but here it is. It also used not only for Russian speakers, but also for external audience, because one of such authors was interviewed, for example, by New Yorker in 2006. You may have heard of Fyodor Berezin, because actually he is Deputy Defense Minister for so-called DNR Republic and the editor of New Yorker and interviewer for this newspaper asked this so-called writer, because if you Google the Wikipedia, you will find that he's professional military, interviewed Berezin and presented him as a great Russian writer, compared him with Tom Clancy, and also noted that great Russian literature predicted the war, because it's great literature, always foresee changes in a society. And the interviewer asked Berezin how local conflict in Ukraine, of course it wasn't a local conflict, will end, and Berezin answers, the best result for Russian-speaking people in Donetsk is the complete destruction of the regime in Kiev. Soviet Union. It was a special civilization, and now I am warned for it. Russia today is capitalist country like United States, not like Soviet Union, which represent new type of civilization in which you can live without undermining or exploiting other people. One day, I hope it will be reborn, maybe in some other country. So just imagine if you heard about great Russian literature, cannot read Berezin's text in English, and he's presented like a great Russian author, you might form a certain perspective on how things in Ukraine is better to be resolved. So such kind of fiction, interviews both for internal audience and external audience, was a very prominent feature in contemporary Russian culture. And such contemporary military fiction that started being published in 2002, it's only part how the war can be perceived. And of course, Ukrainian authors who were also joining volunteering battalions were joining the resistance, and people who were witnessing the war, professional writers, journalists, also were reflecting on that. And Ukrainian literature on current war, a bit different, of course. And I believe since the first books on Russian invasion into Ukraine started appearing in 2015, so approximately in a year after invasion, which makes sense, you need time to produce a book. And I believe the first difference between such Russian contemporary military fiction and Ukrainian literature about the war that started in 2014 is that Russian authors write about imagined war because they started doing that before the actual invasion happened. Therefore, they keep choosing fantasy as a genre, while Ukrainian authors write about a real war. Therefore, a large number of books are documentary literature, but not exclusively. I would like to highlight that all genres are represented. And the second key difference is time perspective. While Russian contemporary military fiction depict near future, a time perspective that allows prophesying and messianism. Ukrainian literature about the war depict the recent past, a time perspective that allows for retrospection, analysis, and the relevation of trauma and experience. And the third key difference, Ukrainian literature about the war is a response. While Russian contemporary military fiction is a predecessor of this war, so we can definitely say that first go novels, then go tanks, unfortunately. And contemporary Ukrainian landscape was dramatically changed one more time on February 24 by full-scale military invasion. Obviously, cultural and educational institutions, infrastructure and logistic were completely distorted or partly damaged. It's worth mentioning that Kharkiv, so heavily shelled till this day, used to be a printing capital of Ukraine, and till this day, city is so constantly shelled, so book production became much more complicated, much more expensive. It's very hard now to estimate losses in human potential. Iryna Rodina published on Pan-Ukraine website a chronic, People of Culture Taken Away by War. And now this chronic keep being updated, and also it became a bigger project, People of Culture Taken Away by a War. I will share a link here in our Zoom chat so you can just click and see and learn more about great people whose works we need to immerse ourselves into, at least to know that their previous heritage is well known here. And this chronic and this huge project by Pan-Ukraine documents how many writers was killed during the full-scale invasion and on which circumstances. Some of them joined our forces or territorial defense units. Some was killed during occupation and found on mass graves. And also a bunch of Ukrainian writers found themselves unable to proceed with the full-time activities as writers. They or joined army or engaged with projects that document war crimes. Illustrating second phenomenon, Kate Surkan wrote an article for the Kyiv Independent, how a celebrated Ukrainian writer turned into war crime researcher. And this article is dedicated to Victoria Amelina, whose tragic death circumstances were discussed yesterday on our panel, as we had a representative of Truth Hound. So we have an audio video recording. So if you would like to listen that presentation, you may have a recording of that. And as not only Victoria and Melanie did such swift, but also Sasha Dovzhik, Larissa Denisenko, Tatiana Ogarkova, and many other cultural workers, people who used to do cultural studies or be historians, like Mariana Matveychuk, who is also Kyiv-Mogil Academy alumni, Alexandra Haidai, who is historian, started working as a local producers to provide assistance to international crew documenting the war. Mstislav Chernov, a photographer who started documenting Mariupol during the full-scale invasion and was awarded Pulitzer Prize. I would like to highlight that Academic Studies Press published English translation of Mstislav Chernov novel, The Dream Time. So you're able to read this beautiful text in English now. And I would like to mention that Pan-Ukraine started regularly organized expeditions to Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast to deliver humanitarian aid. And as I mentioned, disruption of cultural facilities, Pan-Ukraine also visits local libraries and museums to just try to estimate the damage and to get back certain libraries to life. So knowing all of that, I was wondering that I should look closer to literature, mainly fiction, that was written during the war to get some ideas how literary studies should react on all of that. And here I mean some methodologies, theories, and also a critical assessment of the results of our work. And I would like to, I had broader question to myself as a literary scholar on professional duties and civil duties. I know that Kateryna Zarembo has a great essay on conflict between duties we have as scholars, as citizens, and as parents. So I encourage to read the essay collection, Russia's War in Ukraine, 2022, Personal Experience of Ukrainian Scholars. And indeed, there is a huge question, because if writers are in trenches, where literary scholars should be? And I mentioned critical assessment of our work. Decolonization became a buzzword. We have huge conferences on decolonization. And while visiting them, I was trying to compare my experience, my on-the-ground experience, with more academic discussions of decolonization. Part of my family is under occupation. And my relatives were fined because they were speaking in Ukrainian language in private settings. It was like a small corner of supermarket where two people were speaking silently in Ukrainian and they got fined. Their kids decided to go to Ukrainian school online. And of course, local authorities was not happy about that, because in the city came Russian teachers, bring Russian books, bring Dostoevsky, bring Pushkin poetry. And they were threatening my relative that if kids won't go to Russian school where Russian teachers came, kids will be forcefully deported to Russia. So while my family experience is that Dostoevsky is literally used as a tool to colonize part of my family, is that enough if we're putting Ukrainian authors to a syllabi just to add to a bunch of Russian writers, one Ukrainian? So that's what I mean by critical assessment as literary scholar works and professional services. I believe these questions are at least worth to be discussed, because I know they are not comfortable for a lot of people, though they're transforming a field and our knowledge about us as human beings. While I was reading as much fiction on current full-scale invasion and trying to comprehend that, I pop up on Sasha Dobzhik article where she was describing her expedition to Donetsk and Luhansk libraries. And I believe it was article for Ukrainska Pravda. I will share a link as well in chat. I believe in this essay, Sasha catches and sum up the main aim of Ukrainian art and culture during this brutal and unhuman war. And she writes that culture is putting inside yourself each missile and each missile hole on Donetsk road, and being inside of this hole, trying to talk to the world by the language that is understandable to the world. And I believe that this definition captures three main features of current Ukrainian fiction and maybe art and culture on full-scale invasion. And first is procedurality, dealing with unfinished events, processes, and phenomena here and now, and with having no certain idea how everything will end up. Second feature is reflectivity, try to understand what is happening, and third is a communication, because indeed, as we see how literature was used to justify invasion or to prepare a certain audience for the invasion, Ukrainian writers trying to communicate what that means, how it looks like. And as I mentioned, Alexandra Dobzhik, I'll just briefly pop up with a comment how I'm glad that this conference, international conference happening in Kyiv, and it's a symbol that intellectual life is so vivid here. Because new intellectual institutions are also opening here in Ukraine, because recently Index Institute of Documentation and Exchange was opened in Lviv. So probably we'll have more discussions, and I have only 2 minutes, right? So, okay. I just wanted to say that my final conclusion that also why we all should study contemporary Ukrainian literature fiction on full-scale invasion, because it's dramatically changed all theory and perception of trauma studies, as now we have massive amounts of texts that document and reflect, that document trauma in the making. Because each month, each few years, we have a new text about new phase of the war and new experience on that. And I believe it definitely will change trauma studies. Another thing is this current Ukrainian fiction change how we understand readers. It's so interesting how now readers read fiction when it's evident that everything is real and characters are real. And how should readers react? Knowing that fiction is not fiction and crimes is real, can we talk about agency of readers as we talk about agency in civil society? Because now a lot of readers became advocates and supporters. So also this fiction is definitely changed how we understand categories of objectivity and subjectivity in literature. And my final comment is, while my presentation brings more questions than answers, I have one good answer. We need much more case studies, because this war changed not only our experience, but our intellectual experience for all who involved in academia. So let's have more case studies to describe our common new experience. Thank you so much.
Mariia, thank you so much for this presentation. It was extremely interesting for all of us, and I would just like to pick up several things I would like to comment on. One is, of course, your observations and research about the Russian literature preparing the ground for the war. I mean, this is something astonishing. We Ukrainians are talking eloquently, illustrating how Pushkin and Dostoevsky are engaging and internalizing and popularizing all those imperial ideas, but how it lives in the contemporary popular Russian literature of actually low quality, you know, this kind of paperbacks, yeah, how it's produced in dozens and in hundreds real time. This is something which I think all of us should be aware of, also to use as a real argument for our advocacy of what the Russian culture actually does. That the Russian culture kills. And I was wondering, and I would like to ask you if you have any published papers on this, or if you could recommend sources of your work citing these. Could you please also share it in Zoom, because I think it should be disseminated in English and Ukrainian and all other languages, not just for us to be equipped with arguments. And then the other thing is, you mentioned this civic duty dilemma, which has been bothering me all the way. And Stanislav Aseyev, whom we discussed yesterday in Oля Polyakhovich's presentation, is also an active serviceman right now, and his presentation of the republishment of his book has been cancelled because of his civic duties being fulfilled in the moment. He's not being able to be interrupted right now because he's performing his duties at the front line. And then the other book, which is probably also worth our, not probably, but definitely worth our attention, and I would like to bring it to your attention now, is the collected volume done by PEN, Slova i Kuli, Words and Bullets, exactly about this, you know, living aside our professional duties and taking other duties as service people and as volunteers. It has been out, I think, or it is being pre-ordered right now, so it's already advertised on PEN's website as a done fulfilled volume. So I would definitely recommend you to have a look, to purchase it when it is available. Unfortunately, two of its contributors, Victoria Mariia and Maxim Kravtsov, are no longer there, so they have been killed. Maxim Kravtsov in action and Victoria Mariia by the Russian missile. Right. On this, I would like to give floor to our online participant. Kateryna, can you hear us well? Kateryna Busol, can you hear us?
Hello, dear colleagues. Yes, I can hear you well.
Hello. Kateryna, it's great to have you with us. We hear you well too. So I would like to introduce Kateryna. Kateryna Busol is a Ukrainian lawyer and an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy. As a scholar and practitioner, she has worked on various issues related to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, with a particular focus on weaponization of cultural heritage, conflict-related sexual violence, incitement to genocide, and Ukraine's transitional justice process. Kateryna Busol has worked with the Clooney Foundation for Justice, UN Women, and Global Rights Compliance. She has collaborated with Ukrainian NGOs such as the Media Initiative for Human Rights and Truth Hounds, and has advised Ukrainian prosecutors and judges on armed conflict-related proceedings. Dr. Busol has been a fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law and Chatham House, and a visiting professional at the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Her presentation today is dedicated to misrepresented narratives, the Nuremberg judgment, Russia's memory laws, and aggression against Ukraine. Dr. Busol, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Kateryna, for the introduction, and thank you very much, dear colleagues, for allowing me to participate virtually. I miss you essentially by a couple of days, returning to Kyiv on Friday, but very glad to be with you even online. I would like to build my presentation, which I hope will run under 20 minutes, because I wouldn't want to bore you with the legal particularities. Yet I'm hoping that the discussion of Russia's memory laws and actually the design of the Nuremberg judgment, to which we as a nation, from the president to numerous human rights lawyers and prosecutors I work with, refer to so much, that their analysis shows that we have missed certain important inputs with the decolonization and wider narratives that Russia has managed to infuse into the reading of Nuremberg and into the reading of justice since 1945. I will build my presentation in three components. First, I will analyze how the main and the subsequent judgments of the Nuremberg trials show Russia-endorsed narratives of the World War II and do misrepresent the victimhood and the effects of the war of the Nazi Germany onto the Soviet Union. In the second part of my presentation, I will comment on Russia's memory policies and politics since 2014 and how they've changed with a full-scale invasion. And finally, in the concluding section of my presentation, I will address what lessons should we draw from the misrepresentation of the Nuremberg legacy, as well as from Russia's memory policies for the prosecution of Russia's atrocity crimes, as well as for the wider redress for Ukrainian survivors and building wider narratives. But let me take you first to Nuremberg. President Zelensky, at numerous international and domestic fora, notably during his first post-full-scale invasion speech at the UN Security Council, did refer to the Nuremberg trial and claimed that Ukraine would want to have a Nuremberg-like tribunal, which, as you know, the government and the civil society are so passionately trying international partners to convince them to establish. Usually, in our Ukrainian references to Nuremberg, we would quote just certain sections from the judgment, which is several hundred pages long. Usually we would quote, of course, the section which really support Ukraine's claims for the prosecution of the crime of aggression. For instance, stating that the crime of aggression is a supreme international crime which contains within itself an accumulated evil of the whole, which I think both in terms of the poetics of the language as well as the legal precision that the crime of aggression essentially opens up the gates to all other subsequent crimes such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide is a very fitting quote. However, as a lawyer preparing the cases on Russia's war crime, I decided to dive deeper into the wording of the Nuremberg judgment. And what I found are the references to the so-called Southern Russia, or to the suffering of Southern Russians, who were majorly victimized during Nazi Germany occupation. In the same vein, the references to the activities of Eisenstadt Rosenberg, the groups specifically entitled by the Nazi leadership to remove cultural heritage from Eastern occupied territories, were also made with respect to the so-called Southern Russia. Equally, I found that the Nazi leadership claims that certain sections of the Soviet territory would need to be used as a breadbasket for the new empire which Nazi Germany was trying to build, were also made in reference to the so-called Southern Russia. And of course, one doesn't need to decipher too much to understand that those phrases were all euphemisms for the suffering of the Ukrainian people, as well as references to the territory of the current Ukraine. Essentially, this more precise decolonial reading of the Nuremberg judgment is something that we international lawyers need, because during my legal practice as well as the legal research, I haven't really found any studies which would show the nuances of the crimes described in the Nuremberg judgment, which would aptly emphasize that the majority of crimes, as well as the vast proportion of occupation by Nazi Germany, affected the Ukrainian people and the Belarusian people, but not the Russian people or the residents of other Soviet republics. And this is important not only for the purposes of factual clarity. This is important, of course, in how throughout the years Russia was building the image of its principal role as the victorious power, but also the major victim of Nazi crimes, of course, misappropriating this victimhood from other Soviet peoples. And also, as I will demonstrate, the lack of understanding of the scope and the lack of emphasizing of the scope of the effects of Nazi crimes on all Soviet people, and the lack of prosecution of the crimes of the Red Army, largely, of course, directed through and from Moscow, resulted in the fact that many atrocities that we're observing now committed by the Russian forces on the part of the lawyers, they oftentimes lack contextualization. There is a lacking argument about the legacy of oppression through sexual violence, through the renaming, for instance, of the newly occupied territories, first by Soviet Russia and then by contemporary Russia in occupied Ukrainian territories. It's also important to note that Russia has been really attached to the legacy of Nuremberg. So imagine in 2016, Russia introduced amendments to its criminal code, prosecuting any so-called alternative interpretations, both of the Great Patriotic War, as they refer to the Second World War, as well as to the Nuremberg trial. So essentially, any attempts like what we are doing now to say that the references in the Nuremberg judgment to southern Russia actually implicate Ukraine would be criminally punishable in contemporary Russia. And they did have domestic prosecutions on that basis. However, this is not only an issue of criminal law, it's an issue of the wider narratives and the narratives which the Kremlin has been building consistently in the country as well as outside of its borders. These policies have amplified since the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. For instance, Russia has adopted the regulations that would prohibit the activities of domestic NGOs, most notably the Memorial Center, which uncovered the legacy of Soviet and Stalinist, but is widely also Soviet crimes, essentially preventing, impeding any nuanced reading of the Soviet era crimes, as well as the Soviet leadership and the Russian army implication in it. Commenting on one of such unfair trials concerning a historian Yuri Dmitriev, who actually was the one to uncover numerous burial sites, mass graves in Sandarmoh, and thus contributed also to the establishment of more facts about the Ukraine's executed Renaissance. The UN special rapporteurs have established that no official Russian body has ever been mandated to establish in an open and transparent manner a full public record and thus public memory of the atrocities. Human Rights Watch has noted that this crackdown on the critical examination of history, the commemoration of survivors and the wider activities of Russian human rights defenders culminated not only in the closure of their human rights NGOs, but really coincided with the Kyiv's alienation from the Kremlin since the Maidan events, and they skyrocketed with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So we really see how Russia's, which is not surprising, but I think it's so important to speak about these historical injustices with the precision about the fact and law. We really see how Russia's domestic memory policies and legislation have been changing concurrently with the Maidan protests, the initial invasion in 2014, and the full-scale invasion. In 2022, Vladimir Putin adopted this specification to their memory laws, saying that not just the misinterpretation of the Nuremberg trial and the Great Patriotic War was punishable, but it was specified that the denial of the decisive role of the Soviet people over the victory of Nazi Germany and the humanitarian mission of the USSR were criminally punishable. And further on, in the same legislative amendment of April 2022, Vladimir Putin has stated that it would be punishable under administrative law to compare expressly Russia's so-called special military operation, essentially the full-scale onslaught on Ukraine, with any policies of the USSR. Essentially, we see that the ideological component is crucial for legitimizing the activities of the Russian military domestically for themselves, as well as for their civil society, but also they're trying to build a stronger narrative, building upon the misinterpretation of Nuremberg, building upon their Russian alleged positioning themselves as victorious powers and as victims who can never be perpetrators of crimes, neither in the mid-20th century during the World War II, nor in the 21st century in their onslaught on Ukraine. I must say that both luckily and sadly, and I say that as a legal practitioner who's worked on Russian war crimes since 2014, the fact that they have skyrocketed so much and the whole full-scale onslaught has been so exceptionally grave in terms of its impact on human lives. Since 2022, there has been from the legal community more attention not just to the nuances of different alleged war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, but also in assessing what role history and memory, as well as memory laws, play in the commission of these atrocities. So, for instance, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has noted at least two important contextual historical factors. First, they noted that Russia historically has not been held accountable for its numerous violations, and the UN Commission of Inquiry referred predominantly to the more recent situations such as the invasion of Georgia, occupations of parts of Moldova, as well as the two Chechen wars and Russia's participation in directly or proxy through mercenaries in different armed conflicts in the African and Latin American region. Although the UN Commission of Inquiry did not specifically mention Russia's weaponization of memory related to the World War II and the Nuremberg trial, they rightly said that the legacy of impunity that has been accompanying Russia's history has really amplified the severity with which they are committing crimes against Ukrainians. And also the UN Commission of Inquiry has confirmed that Russia has consistently used dehumanizing language towards Ukrainians that not only amplifies, but in a way validates or excuses their mistreatment of Ukrainians. And of course, among the examples of such dehumanizing language, the UN Commission of Inquiry has expressly noted and discussed the use of word Nazis, which again brings us to the one-dimensional interpretation of the legacy of Nuremberg, where Russia claims that as a victorious power, it can never be a perpetrator of war crimes. It's also crucial to understand that a nuanced understanding of history is very important for the legal assessment of particularly certain international crimes, namely the crime of genocide and the crime of persecution, which is the crime against humanity of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population pursuant to certain discriminatory policies. And while certain facts which I'm mentioning now might seem very apparent for us Ukrainians and scholars, foreign scholars who work on Ukraine and are more familiar with the nuances of our history and Russia's imperial legacy, I can really testify that the majority of international lawyers, foreign international lawyers coming from the spectrum of foreign countries, they don't necessarily know this. So that is why the more nuanced examination and explanation of Russia's role in the World War II, how they use the references to Nazis, how they use their references towards their allegedly unique role in ending the World War II, how that enables and emboldens the direct perpetrators on the ground in Ukraine. I'm also hoping, and I will finalize here, that Ukraine, both domestically, but also in its submissions to the International Criminal Court and domestic prosecutions in foreign states, will amplify the role of history and language, in particular for the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide. I will not go into the further details. If you'd like, we can investigate that in the Q&A session. But the crime of genocide is notoriously hard to prove, and usually it happens post factum after so many deaths or other injuries have been inflicted. But the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide has a slightly different threshold for proving and establishing and proving. Language, of course, and history has a very particular connotation for this crime. And again, I'm hoping that we as Ukrainian lawyers and together with the specialists on history, on literature, on linguistics, that we will be able to build strong submissions internationally to really show the historical legacy of oppression and impunity that has enabled Russia to act with so much viciousness against our people since 2014. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kateryna, for this fascinating presentation. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions to you during the Q&A, and I personally got a better understanding of, like, we often marvel at how Germans in particular can be so can feel so much blame towards Russians, but not so much towards Ukrainians. So, okay, it actually stems from very important legal documents, and this is also the reason for this. Right. I have also a question straight away, but I will also leave it for Q&A. Thank you very much for your civic duty, for how you contribute to bringing Russia to justice. With this, I would like to move on to our next speaker, Iryna Borysiuk. Iryna Borysiuk is a PhD and an associate professor at the Volodymyr Moranets Department of Literature at the National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy. Her scholarly interests include contemporary Ukrainian poetry, issues of literature and identity, and the construction of subjectivity in literary texts. Iryna Borysiuk has also authored short stories for teenagers, and her play, The Voice, won first prize in the British Council's UK radio drama competition in 2018. Iryna Borysiuk will dedicate her presentation to the topic Women's Language and Women's Silence, Comprehending War in the Lyrics of Kateryna Kalytko. Dr. Borysiuk, please.
Thank you for the introduction, and let's start. Here's your language, woman, shoot from it. Is probably the most famous poetic reflection on the current Ukrainian-Russian war that draws attention to the concept of language, which is very important for Kateryna Kalytko. Language, on the one hand, is opposite to silence and namelessness, and on the other hand, it breaks down into sound and writing, or rather sounds and letters, the semantic validity of which is determined not so much by the obviousness of the actual meaning distinguishing function as by the transformation of ordering of space. Yeah. The attention to the loci that forms the landscape is comparable to the specific tactics of conceptualization in Kalytko's lyrics, which can be called the anatomy of language, which has a non-homogeneous structure and a specific profile. Kalytko lovingly captures those features: grammar, phonetics, and syntax. The imagery of the collection People with Verbs, Люди з дієсловами, is built around Ukrainian grammar, among other things. Developing the poetics of the verb in the collection, Kalytko etymologically explains the name of the grammatical category, the word that equals action. Kalytko directly contrasts the moral impartiality of naming, which is correlated with the noun, with the active voice of the verb. I quote, "At such a depth where no one can catch us, where nouns are melted into a living verb." End quote. In this sense, Kalytko's poetry ignores the postmodern interpretation of the author as a scriptwriter, an author as a conventional textual function. Speech or silence is always a moral choice. In fact, the request for integrity and authenticity, a person as what he or she says, in fact, the coincidence of the inner self and the social role allows us to speak of a change in the trend of contemporary poetry. To be more precise, the war only emphasizes the trends that were already evident in the contemporary Ukrainian poetry of the 10th and 20s, a turn to the real, weakening of a dialogue with other texts, factuality and documentariness, a demand for accuracy, a focus on memory, the prevalence of literality of a metaphor, less attention to emotional, psychological, personal vicissitudes due to increased interest in the drama of history. It is also about actualizing moral questioning, realizing the importance of moral judgment. In this sense, writing as a verb is also a moral act. The grammatical structuring of the letter collection is also confirmed by the title of the subsection, personal pronoun. It seems that Kalytko purposefully rethinks the fixation of Ukrainian modern poetry on the name. Nounness, in a broad sense, implies the position of a creator who has the power over words and things, and naming fixes existence within its rigid limits. And if Kalytko sees to contrast the passive naming that is the basis of a noun with the active reshaping of the world by a verb, the reorientation from the name to the pronoun is the next step, focusing on a shared experience and collective memory. The fact is that the inherently romantic opposition between the unique subjective self and the undifferentiated masses became a key marker of Ukrainian identity in the poetry of the last century, opposite to the Soviet emphasis on collectivism. It is worth mentioning the poetry of the Ukrainian 60s, the best examples of which refer to neo-romantic stylistic in one way or another. This tendency is intensified in the poetry of the 80s. Volodymyr Morinets called it the return of the subject, which was the next step after the return of the object in the poetry of the 60s. However, in contemporary Ukrainian poetry, this apology for name, as well as the emphasis on the uniqueness of subjective experience, seems to be losing ground. Kalytko's turn from noun to pronoun is precisely the way to personal involvement in collective experience, the presence of a certain model that takes into account the value of the subjective, but at the same time paves the way for dialogue through the presence of common experience and common grounds for existence. Rethinking one's own subjectivity within the we indicates the emergence of a very interesting trend related to the conceptualizing of community experience. At one time, researchers of the testimonial genre, and George Judis among them, defined it as an authentic narrative told by a witness who was prompted to tell it by the urgency of the situation. It could be famine, war, social disasters, etc. As George Judis puts it, the witness portrays his or her experience not as representative, but as an agent of collective memory and identity. Thus, we are dealing with the consolidation of the national subject through the process of testimony. Since the narrator does not appear as a representation of the referent, which is, for example, a nation or a community, but as a practice involved in the development of such unity, testimonial writing should be understood primarily as an action, a tactic by which people are involved in the process of self-construction and survival. Of course, testimonial as a genre has its own peculiarities. Researchers of the testimonial genre emphasize that these are texts written primarily by non-professional writers, often even illiterate people, with the help of an editor or journalist. And that the importance of this aesthetic in such texts is less than their political significance. Instead, Kalytko's texts are poetry, written by a professional writer, and one of the most significant figures in the contemporary cultural process. It would seem, how can a very specific genre that emphasizes the marginal and popular and high poetry legitimized by dominant cultural and publishing institution come into contact? This makes sense if we recall the rapid and avalanche-like process of decolonization of our cultural space, which takes place both at the level of personal everyday practices and habits and in the public space, at the level of cultural institution, public initiatives. It is in this vein that we can talk about the construction of collective subjectivity, including through the act of storytelling, literature which emerged as a direct response to the event of war, when the entire community, not just a separate part of it, is threatened and therefore mobilized in a situation of survival. Udis emphasizes that the witness who speaks shares his personal story with the community to which he belongs. In this sense, the speaker doesn't speak to the community and doesn't represent it, but rather performs an act of identity formation that is both personal and collective. Kalytko speaks about this intersection of personal and collective experience in her poem, Personal Pronoun. I quote, "Neither past nor future yet, and I only ask, speak, let this language not disappear, let it be common." Unquote. Speaking language is a response to chaos because through speech the outlines of a new world emerge. The commonality of language in the final sentence is about the importance of personal understanding at the level of I and you, and the importance of developing a language of understanding in the community. And it is the poem Personal Pronoun that captures the sliding between I and we that is important for Kalytko, which is emphasized in the final poem Catechism, where the beginning of the poem is precisely the consolidation of the community in the face of the threat of destruction. I quote, "What is happening? They have come to kill us," unquote. Such a strategy, defining the subject of speech through we, positioning oneself as a part of the threatened community, can be called a performative act of identity formation. The relationship between language and reality, which take the forms of a rupture or interaction, has been a key feature of Kalytko's poetry since 2014. Her latest poetry collection, People with Verbs, has an interesting feature. Kalytko consciously refuses to invent language as a specific poetic gesture, reflecting the trauma of war on a structural level, and appeals to the conventional contextual language that we as a society have created since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And this is a language that is directly related to reality, not to other texts. This feature manifests itself not so much in the strengthening of the narrative nature of poetry, although this is also present, but in the constant appeal to common experience, to what has already been experienced, to what can be called common knowledge. The dramatic change in our lives from our worldview to our everyday practices has influenced change in language and has emphasized the emergence of a new literality. Death, war, and darkness are no longer metaphors. In this situation, the direct recording of experience in the fullness of an extended narrative seems to be an expected strategy. The story of our losses and victories told in detail. Such a detailed narrative is most often export-oriented, aimed at an outsider, someone who is out of context. It can be descendant or a sympathetic other. In any case, the addressee here is outside the temporal or spatial continuum outlined by the indescribable, inexpressible experience of existential horror in which the lyrical subject is located. The addressee by default is someone who has not experienced the lyrical subject experience, but is inclined to listen empathetically. And it is this aspect that influences the formation of the narrative, because it is about the difficulty of converting into language those things before which language is powerless. Instead, the recipient of Kalytko's poetry is located not outside, but inside the circle. The poet does not tell us what it is like to lose relatives, to lose limbs, to die quickly or slowly, to sit in shelters or in the trenches, to lose and regain contacts. Her narrative is for her people, for those who know, which means that she can avoid details and long explanations. The war reality in Kalytko's poetry is not a story, but a memory, not a continuous thread, but a dotted line. In this sense, People with Verbs resonates in some ways with Ostap Slivinsky Dictionary of War, unexpectedly poetic despite the conceptual non-monological nature of the text. Both collections record changes in language, compile dictionaries that correspond to the new reality. And when Kalytko writes, I quote, as if with a plywood shield against the wild evil, end quote, and as if I could smell the smoke from your tense shoulder, end quote. These are not metaphors, but references to recognizable events and realities of the revolution of dignity. Construction helmets and plywood shields, paving stones as weapons, burned tires, the smell of smoke by which protesters were recognized. Shoving giblets into their torn bellies is not a literal exaggeration, but a real story of Volodymyr Rybak, who was tortured in Russian-occupied Gorlivka for flying the Ukrainian flag. This reference to the real appears as a dotted line, a hint, and rarely becomes the foundation for a coherent narrative. When it comes to narrative poems, it is worth mentioning Time is Nesting in Baileys, a poem about a woman in an occupied town who was finally waited for her army to arrive and is now digging potatoes for the soldiers. A neighbor who burned down in the Debaltseve Keldron is a parable told in the language of visionary, dreamlike imagery. A dream about a dead soldier that occurred during the full-scale invasion becomes a story about the mobilization of a community of the dead, the living, and the unborn. Now it became clear. On the other side, angels, the reservists, were called to a meeting. Similarly, the starting point of the other narrative is the grain corridor, the export of grain by a country at war. I quote, and the heavy grain ships sail over the horizon, and death dances over each of the warm decks. End quote. Death here is not only about the present, as in her other text. Kalytko deepens the narrative in this poem by appealing to collective experience. I quote, there are much more than the memory of hunger, of transparent figures from the night, end quote. However, in this case, memory is actualized not through affirmation, but through opposition. Sowing the land with grain, despite the danger, is not a trauma of the past, but an aspiration to the future. I quote, for this is the right to grow, to sow, to look deeply, not the animal fear that tomorrow there will be nothing to eat, end quote. It is worth mentioning one more important technique that becomes extremely expressive in Kalytko's latest collection. It is about the use of a common, recognizable rhetoric, understandable for our people, topoi, that do not require interpretation or translation. This topoi can take the form of memes, rhetorical questions, aphorisms, or even references to broader text and situations. Their key feature is their inclusion in the media context, recognizability, and prevalence throughout society, not in any particular social segment. Such topoi include, for example, the meme about cyborgs, the defenders of the Donetsk airport. People demonstrate miracles of endurance and superpowers, withstand everything. However, concrete and iron do not withstand and collapse. In Kalytko's poetry, this recognizable topos becomes a part of a broader context and a more complex network of symbols. A human being against iron, a human being against history, a human being against death. I quote, "In fact, there was nothing terrible about our fate. It was just the epochs and men standing with big scissors. They cut the umbilical cords, family memories, and lives. Can you do it now?" I answered, "I can. It's just a war or a famine, a drunkard or a bigamist. It was just sticky with blood to walk on the ground. They just moved the border. They took away grain and milestones. Can you stand it now?" I answered, "I can handle it." Unquote. The vertical temporal context in Kalytko's poetry is also deepened as modernity appears not as an isolated mode, but as a part of a broader perspective that encompasses the entire 20th century. The woman who just sold the apartment and bought Kevlar helmets, they all held up, but the concrete did not, has behind her stories of other women's resistance, even if this resistance was to survive. Kalytko also expands the context of the topos. This is a woman trying to survive war and famine, but also struggling with illness, domestic violence, and social prejudices. By appealing to the shared knowledge of which such recognizable topoi are a part, Kalytko tries to include it in the common experience, the displaced and silent stories of women whose often invisible resistance ensured the survival of the community. Another interesting example is a very literary metaphor of the open fracture of history. I quote, "It is not yet the end of history, only its open fracture." Unquote. It seems that the reference to the famous book by the philosopher and futurologist Francis Fukuyama, The End of the History and the Last Man, is on the surface, but the conclusion is premature. Kalytko is actually referring not so much to this famous thesis of Fukuyama or even to the critical polemics around it, but to the specific media context in the current war, which finally negates the assumption of the probability of an evolutionary transformation of humanity in line with the values of the Western world. This dubious thesis about the end of history goes beyond the narrow confines of academic discussions and become a part of our shared context at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, where Fukuyama actively supports Ukraine in numerous publications and interviews. In other words, the open fracture of history is not so much a poetic appropriation of the famous quote as its media transformation in the context of the current war. However, by referring to the media rhetoric as a shared knowledge, Kalytko's poetry doesn't actually fall into rhetoric and publicistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pani Yaryna, for this immersion from the perspective of a literary scholar into Kateryna Kalytko's poetry. As you were talking, I was looking through the poems which you referred to, because, you know, it is nice when you discuss the piece of art to look at this piece of art. And I thought that as a pre-conclusion before the break, which we are going to have, I hope that the audience allows me to read a poem by Kateryna Kalytko, with which you started. I think everyone knows it, ось тобі мова, жінко, this is the language to you women, shoot from it. But what could be a better honor of the author's output than to get back to it once again. I will read in Ukrainian, and I encourage those of you who are following it in Ukrainian to look for the English translation. It's widely available. Ось тобі, жінко, мова. Стріляй із нею. Захищай себе до останнього подиху. І ні за що не дозволяй їм наблизитись. Використовуй вбудовану систему радіоперехоплення і прилад нічного бачення. Все це є всередині. І не бреши, що не вмієш. Пильно відстежуй дислокацію ворога і найменші його просування. Підпусти на віддаль пострілу, а тоді припадай до прицілу і вже не зволікай. Набоїв припасано вдосталь. Їх не шкодуй. Якщо ж скінчаться, виробляй їх зі слів. Тільки тоненькі жіночі пальці здатні на цю моторику. І ні за що ні за що не дозволяє їм наблизитися до старої межі, на якій розляглася батькова слива. Як перейдуть її, доведеться йти в рукопаш. От тоді вже прохромлюй багнетом, ріж від вуха до вуха, розпанахуй, роз'юшуй та оббіловуй, поки світло перед очима остаточно не змеркне. Як отямишся, погладиш колючу потилицю синові новобранцю, чоловікові милиці подаси, а тоді все спочатку. Хто сказав, що кидаємо на призволяще? Ми озброїли, як могли. I think this is extremely beautiful and powerful. Pani Iryna, thank you very much again. And with this, I invite us all to a short coffee break, and we will see each other again on this panel and with our online audience in 10 minutes. So dear colleagues, we are going back to our panel, and I'm very happy to introduce to you, our next speaker, Yaryna Chornohuz, who moderated yesterday's panels, the opening of the conference. But I would like to reiterate her biography. Yaryna Chornohuz is a Ukrainian poet, translator, combat medic, and senior corporal of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Since 2017, Yaryna has been engaged in writing and translating poetry. She has participated in various poetry-related projects and contests. In 2019, she became laureate of the Smolosky Publishing House Literary Contest for her poetry collection entitled How the Circle of War Mutates. While pursuing her master's degree, she also completed translations of books by Matt Haig and Erin Gunter from English into Ukrainian. In 2019, Yaryna graduated from the Humanities Faculty of the National University of Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy. That same year, she joined the Ukrainian military as a medic with the Hospitaliers Medical Battalion, serving as a combat medic in the war in the Donbas of eastern Ukraine. Yaryna was in active service in the Donbas when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and continued to serve in the war in active duty in Popasna, Mariupol, and Bakhmut. On the 19th of May 2022, Yaryna was awarded Ukraine's Medal for Life-Saving. In 2024, she was awarded with Ukraine's highest prize in the arts, the Shevchenko National Prize of Ukraine, for her poetry collection entitled Design, the Defense of Presence. That same year, she also became laureate of the Women in Arts Award and the Lviv UNESCO City of Literature Award. Yaryna, we are extremely honored by your presence today and by the fact that you managed to carve out your precious time to present the presentation entitled Poetry by Those in Military Service, How the War Affects Poetic Language and Its Potency as Testimony.
Thank you for invitation. You know, it's a little bit difficult to generalize my experience as poet because right now I have to tell about my poetry, but it's better actually to read poetry than to retell it or to have like deep analysis like Iryna, for example, can do. But it's better to do with someone's poetry, not yours. But I'll try. So being a poet myself and military service member with experience of combatant experience as reconnaissance and combat medic, I'll try to share with you my notices and thoughts of how the combatant experience and realities of army in wartime affects a poet and his or her poetic voice. So my apologies, I'll be less academic, I think, and more spontaneous and expressive in my observation of this. First of all, and as I said yesterday, when you are a poet on the war, especially when you are both a poet and a combatant in the combat unit on the active defensive war, the poetry becomes a very special thing for you. The poetry becomes an only place where you can express not only your secret feelings, which you cannot share actually with your comrades because you cannot be sensitive on the war. Not only these secret feelings, emotions, but also to express the truth which cannot be expressed in any another way than as a poem. The writing a poetry on war means to have a place for your own deep inner meditation. So good poetry on the war is almost always a meditation as a genre, I would say. This inner meditation in terrible risk and hard conditions. The writing a poetry on war means to preserve humanity and civility there where the enemy submerges you in the conditions of primitive savagery. As my German friend and publisher told me in private conversation in Kyiv, the poetry and the diary are actually, according his observations, the only genres which are convenient and affordable for combatants in active war. Poetry, because of its laconic form and hermetic language, and diary, because of its simplicity and opportunities to express yourself directly without artificial work with text. Frankly speaking, I wrote a diary in paper of my combat experience in 2021-2022, but it was left and destroyed along with my backpack in occupation. And it is always a risk that your writings will come to enemy and can be published by him. We know such examples, by the way, in lots of war conflicts around the world, if talking about diary. Which you cannot say about poetry, of course, because of reputation of this genre as very literate genre, which actually enemy cannot use. And because most of poet combatants, when they have access to internet on our war, they usually post themselves these poems quickly in social media because you never knew if you'll be alive tomorrow. Thus, I call this second poetry collections, which is called Design Defense of Presence, as my poetic diary. So this is actually collection of poems, but in these poems, actually my and combatant experience and this my secret feelings and this my analyzing about what does it mean to preserve humanity in yourself and what philosophy brings you the war experience. I can say then that we have this kind of genres, and not genres, but this kind of motifs in poetry written by combatants. The poetry as the last trace of yours. Like you write poems, you try to publish them as anything, as a post in social media or as a book, because you don't know if something will remain of you in when you are living in the regime of week, months, and you don't know if you'll be alive then. Another motif, the poetry as the way to relieve yourself, to relieve your pain from the losses of comrades. So the losses is also a big motif in all war poetry. The poetry as a way to save memory of your comrades who became after their death the statistics of war. So this is the reason why poets, Ukrainian poets who are also combatant, they usually dedicate their text to their comrades or yes, the one who defended Ukraine with them. The poetry as testimony of the combat operations and combat path of your unit, because you often write a poem which is in certain place, like lots of poems in this collection, they are written in territory that are currently occupied. And when it's created in this territory. It has a special sense of these territories. The poetry of competence, I can assume, are always less metaphoric, has less exalted language and more direct, because as the first word in the name of this collection, design, appeals to Heidegger and his theory of design as being here and now, and it appeals to this idea that actually poems are existentials. They fix a certain existentials of your initiation. Poetry and var is always very, very close to this initiation. It shows the path of your initiation, and it fixes this existential thing of this. That's why it is more direct and actually as a testimony of your combat experience. Just to finish, my last point, and I'll quote you one, I read you one poem. So yesterday, Askold told a point that poetry is always about more being than doing. But in fact, poetry by competence combines those two things, being and doing. And in this way, this renews a poetic language very seriously and poetic abilities of your native language. Because the good art, in my opinion, is always born from good initiation and trying yourself. This is the reason why poetry has become more popular genre in Ukraine right now because of the war, because war has this abilities to this is one of smallest good conclusions of war and combatant experience, that it renews language. It shows her from very different side. It renews the literature and brings lots of new context and new experience. To the end, I'd like to say that there are lots of Ukrainian poet combatants, and among them also are those who are passed away in battle, and they are really worth translation to English, and for all world could read about their experience, as Maxim Krivtsov, for example, and as Alexander Gumanyuk, who is went missing, went missing but left a beautiful poems. Also live poets like, for example, Artur Dron, Valery Puzik, also female soldiers, like a few of them even don't have a publishing right now, but I hope they soon will have that. So lots and lots of them, and please discover, read them and translate them, because it is unique experience and it worth academic research too. So I'll read the translation of my poem. Those who shall die in battle. Those who shall die in battle have two bright eyes. At far, nobody ever decides to die in battle. That's worthless book romantic. And yet, if one needs to talk about them, then I feel them too well. Their appearance in your life is like illumination, kinda, here you are. Once they know by your gaze, you know who they are and how they will go. They start to talk to you at the level of heart. And talks at the level of heart are always about nothing. And often are spoken or silence. You make signs turning around while you walk behind each other so as not to be heard by the enemy. Talks in the language of heart are like oak leaves. There is hardly anything more lasting and eternal than them. Then their silent presence in the middle of summer, which will go into the ground too until the next oblivion. That's how keep silent while talking to you those who decided to die in battle. That's how they talk to you while keeping silent those who decided to die in battle. You are revealed to them like truth. They are revealed like truth to you. And in a desire to tell that there is nothing on the whole earth more important than him, you have no power to hold time, even for an instant. You are powerless. You can't give him anything except for the road from your heart. And still, they feel your knowing of who they are better than their own body. And in an unconscious desire to die first, they expose their soul fear. It is better to go blind, to not exist. Anything is better, only not to outlive the death of one whose heart adheres them to the world like an invisible silver pin, only to be the first. And on the conveyor belt of the death, which already that Russia loaded us onto, we don't let go each other, even in nothingness. Let nothingness not part you. Yes. Every time you want to be wrong about the brightness of those eyes, the eyes of those who decided one day to die in battle are always brighter than others. Thank you.
Yaryna, thank you very much for this very moving presentation. And of course, myself and we are all heartbroken to know about your diary, which went missing. And this is, of course, another big loss for the Ukrainian literature. I wanted to start with this since you were the first in our program, and I wanted to start with this. I'm very glad that I have this opportunity now. I would like every one of us to join me in the applause to you for your service, for your sacrifices, as well as to all the servicemen and women who are allowing us to live our lives and to have these conferences, these conversations, and to keep writing poetry and to keep fighting.
Thank you so much.
With this, I would like to open our Q&A. And I have, let me just check how many questions we have online and how many questions we have offline. Just please signal to me if you have any questions or comments, maybe, or want to share your feedback. It also regards the presenters. You're also allowed to make comments and questions. We have one in the audience. Okay, and one question from, no, I do have from Ola. Yeah. Okay, so I suggest that we actually collect questions. We hear them all because I assume they would be maybe addressed to different people, and I also have my questions. So let's start with, I will read out the question from Yuri Omelchenko. This is the question to Kateryna Busol. Are Ukrainian legal teams able to use all available evidence from social media and search companies in making a case for incitement for genocide? Are there still categories of such evidence that are not available for Ukrainian teams? And would such evidence be an important part of the case? So this is a question in 3 questions. Yes, could you please just, yeah, did you have a question or a comment, right? Yeah.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much. I do have the question. I think I should outline that for, can you hear me fine?
Sorry.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, we can hear you well, yes.
Ah, perfect, thank you. I think I should outline that there are 2 main criteria for proving incitement to genocide, that such incitement should be direct and public. This is the jurisprudence that we have from Nuremberg, from the Rwandan tribunal, and from the Yugoslav tribunal. And with public, especially with Russia propaganda figures of people like Medvedev or Putin, there's no so much concern to prove it, right? This public element. They usually voice their inciting messages through public speeches, through Telegram channels, or through certain TV programs like the evening TV show with Solovyov. So a public component in the case of Russia and in the era of mass media and social media is not the tricky. What's the trickiest is the direct criterion, because it's important to prove that an inciting message directly calls to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And this is a little bit more nuanced, because international courts have been saying that just general hate speech is awful. It should be prosecuted under other charges. But to prove directness, there should be something else. So essentially, this is where Ukrainian legal teams need the most of support. Luckily, many of the publications or the speeches, as I mentioned, they're available online. So for instance, many of them would have the very literal calls to the extermination or to the establishment of labor camps or the re-education. But my point is that the legal teams that I know that are working on incitement cases, they're trying to team up with the IT or AI professionals and teams who would help them process such information better, right? Because you can imagine that there are so many episodes of Solovyov's TV shows, right? Or so many telegrams posts by Simonyan or Medvedev. So if you have any recommendations about such platforms, I would be grateful. A couple of Ukrainian IT companies and the research institutions from university-based internationally, they do team up with Ukrainian human rights lawyers, but any advice on the IT AI companies that do media analysis of a large scale would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. Then I suggest that we proceed with collecting questions. Please, gentlemen, instruct each other.
Thank you for the question. You know, for me, the poetry and poem is a moment of truth. The truth can be very different. It can be truth about your experience or your comrades, or about the loss, and it can be also about some like more general things, like actually why do we resist, actually who is our enemy, about maybe some historiographical things. Of course, you know, there is a thing that all militaries, they are dehumanized always in all wars. I'll explain you what I mean. Like, you know, there is a thing which is often very unconscious thing when you think that military is someone like, you know, golden heroes who are like doing very hard job, like they are always in battles. You know, there is this thing, and I don't think that you have this. I think like general thing. This is a general thing, and it has impact on our like pieces of arts, on our poetries and text as well. Like it's written, it is written by golden hero. Yes, so this is something very, I don't know, golden and heroic. But sometimes people forget that militaries are same people. So we lots of poetries we can, I don't know, write as civilian could write. Some they are very, very different. It depends what do you need to express, and when you are on the front line, there is no like unimportant things on the front line. Everything becomes very important there, and it can be anything. So the thing is that you feel like you have to talk about that and express your feeling of truth about that. It can be as your personal truth, as meditation, and about truth about more general things. So it is like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will start with a small comment. I'm happy to share that one colleague of us is about to include your poetry, Yaryna, to a crash course of Ukrainian literature and resistance in American universities. So we're happy that this conference was a bridge for that. It was such a what a nice conference. And I just wanted to ask Yaryna, where do you publish your poetry? Which social media? So maybe audience who's interested to follow your new works can follow them. And how can we support your unit?
Thank you for this question. Well, actually, my poetry is likely to be translated in English because I have lots of, I don't know, asks about that. And there are a few publishing houses which are to translate it, and I hope that I'll choose the one who is quickest because it is long. You know, it takes long time to in European and American publishing house to publish actually the book. It's not like in Ukraine, like you gave text and 3 months you have a book. It's not like that. So maybe there will be some translation. There are translation into Polish, and when I write something, I immediately post it in my Facebook and Instagram page, and for me it's okay. Some people think it's not serious enough, like you have to be published in magazine, but for me it's like we've just talked about this with my English translator, that she was amused by this thing in Ukraine society at all, that all poets, they just post on Facebook and they have immediately feedback from audience, and it like makes some authors Western envious about this, because like you have that you cannot, if you're published in magazine, you cannot publish that in social media, or you can just post photo from magazine in social media. So yes, I'm doing that, and I really appreciate feedback about this, and I just want to add that, you know, poetry written in the war, it's like, you know, flower which grown on the mud, and it's better not to have that flower at all, actually. So it's the poetry which is better not to be written, but it is like it is.
I'm so sorry. I just have to repeat Kateryna's quote for New York Times, that in Ukraine, donation is the most common form, is the most well-spread form of civil resistance. That's why part of our conference is a fundraiser, and I still would like people to know that if you really would like to support Yaryna's unit, probably there is things we can do.
Yeah. Right now, this conference is dedicated for the Timur. My unit is currently have everything what we need, and I think if you can just I don't know, I post when we need something important on my social media pages, and there you can actually donate or something. But I can say that right now we have a good level of everything. Like we have everything that we need.
That's good. So I will, if you are feeling okay with it, I will share your social media in our chat on Zoom.
Thank you very much. And we still have some 3 minutes left. And now finally, I will ask my questions. I have to apologize in advance because I am not a literary scholar and I am an IR scholar. And maybe my questions will be super naive, but I would still like to ask them. And I have a question to each of you. I promise to be brief. Mariia, I would like to ask, so you study Ukrainian fiction generally and after the full-scale invasion. So what would you recommend to read about this war from Ukrainian authors? Maybe 1, 2, 3, 1 to 3 names and titles. Then Kateryna, I know this is a super long question. Maybe you're being asked this often, but I'd still like to ask, how can we actually legally bring Russia to justice and not just, top, let's say, top criminals like Putin, but also every single criminal? How is it legally possible? Iryna, I would like to ask you, as far as Kateryna Kalytko's poetry is concerned, and this war goes on for 10 years, over 10 years now. What dynamics do you see in Kateryna Kalytko's poetry before February 22 and after, dedicated to the Russian aggression? And Yaryna, you mentioned these rising stars in poetry among the service people, men and women, who you would recommend to read and follow. And I was wondering, maybe you could recommend these names to us so that we know them already now. I would suggest that you answer in the reverse order. So Yaryna starts, and then Iryna, and then Kateryna, and then Mariia.
Yes, so you asked me to repeat the names, right? Of those poets.
little known, who aren't published yet, yeah? Maybe who don't have books yet.
For example, Eva Tur, she is Reconnaissance, and she's a female soldier, and from 2013, so she has quite nice poetry. For example, Vasek Duchnovsky, as far as I know, he got an offer from publishing house, and maybe they would have an absolutely beautiful book together with his wife, who is actually civilian and volunteer. So, but she's also writing poetry. So they are going to have like together like that, and they are very deep and philosophical. And this is not primitive poetry at all. It's very nice poetry. For example, Iryna Bobik is also a soldier, a combat medic, and also a combatant. He has just published a collection of both poetry and novels in one of the publishing houses. So it also worth reading. And of course, Olena Bilozarska, who is well known as a documentalist and as an officer of Ukrainian Armed Forces. She's also have very beautiful poems. This is who are unpublished. Those who have publication, I've named them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your complicated question. For Kateryna Kalytko, the war started not in 2022, because the war themes and motives were presented in her poetry. In her prose book, The Little Scary Fairy Tales, and her early poems, she wrote about the Balkan Wars, Balkans experience, and her best poem, in my opinion, is about the siege of Sarajevo. As for the experience of full-scale invasion reflected in her poems, I would like to stress the motive of voice, language, and maybe and silence also. And this experience is female in the core, in the nature. And maybe that's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Kateryna, please.
Thank you for your question. I think there are three principal ways to ensure Russia's accountability. First, and I will say it both as a lawyer working on Ukrainian cases, but also as a lawyer who studied other conflicts across the globe, we will not be able to ensure the accountability of every single direct perpetrator. Objectively, because many of them have already been killed, also because there's certainly no capacity domestically in Ukraine, in The Hague or elsewhere to prosecute every single person. In terms of the criminal proceedings, what's important, and the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor General stresses this, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, I think is to show the patterns of violence that Russia weaponizes against Ukrainians. For instance, there's increasingly more evidence that torture and sexualized torture is the policy of waging violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories. And while certain emblematic perpetrators will be addressed in these patterns of crimes, it will not be every single person who directly tortured or rapes. I think we should approach the responsibility question actually from a perspective of a victim and of a survivor, how we can redress every single person who suffered. And this actually is more possible. For instance, the amazing women from SEMA Network Ukraine, this is the Association of Women Survivors of Sexual Violence, conflict-related sexual violence. They catalyzed urgent interim reparations, which is essentially medical, psychological support with the housing for victims of Russia's crimes. And such individual reparations should be ensured by Ukraine and by international partners to all the victims, right? So this is the immediate help to survivors. And if we speak about the wider narrative, which I think is very important, again, about Russia's atrocities, I think instead of thinking about the courts, criminal proceedings, we should think about the experience of truth commissions, which were held in South Africa, in Colombia, in Peru, which essentially is a panel, not of just lawyers, but crucially of literature scholars, of historians, of people who know the culture and specialize in the legacy of the region. And such truth commissions, they hear the stories of survivors and they essentially build the larger narrative, not about every specific crime, but about the dynamics of the conflict. What were its enablers? And I think it's crucial in the context of Ukraine, again, to show first that the aggression started not in 2022, but in 2014. But in fact, it's the lack of action on Russia's imperialism, the actual one, the Soviet and the contemporary Russia's imperialism, that has catalyzed this aggression. So again, I would say targeted prosecutions of patterns of crimes, targeted support to survivors through individual reparations, as well as a truth-seeking initiative that would build the narrative about Russia's neo-imperial encroachment on Ukraine, for Ukrainian survivors, for the international community, and crucially also for Russian citizens who will not be able to turn away from the truth that they have waged against Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kateryna, for your insightful answer. And finally, Mariia.
I will be extremely short as I shared the links and promised to send everything via email. I'll just shout out to Apophony magazine that translates poetry, short fiction in very fast manner. Also, I will shout out to Ukrainian London Review that published a special issue on ecocide, and will recommend Olesya Skromaychuk, a brilliant Ukrainian historian, her nonfiction on her brother. And of course, Tamara's Duda or Tamara Horikha-Zernia novel, The Daughter, on the beginning of the Russian invasion into the Donetsk region and the birth of Ukrainian volunteering movement. So I will send that everything on email. and maybe we'll add some more.
Okay, wonderful. I think on this note, we conclude, right? No, we don't conclude on this note. No, we have the speech from Nadia.
So thank you so much for the wonderful speeches. And now I will say a few more words about Timur Plush and the fundraising that we are doing for him. So Timur is an alumnus from Kyiv-Mogilянська Academy, from the Faculty of Economic Studies. And thanks, first of all, thanks to all of your donations, because we and Timur are really thankful because it really helps to support his brigade. It shows that dedication that the university pays to its alumni and all the support. And I would like to kindly remind you that we are still fundraising for a quadricycle for his brigade. But first, a huge thanks to the university, because it has participated in the previous fundraising for an anti-drone rifle that is now serving in the brigade of Timur. And it was huge because we managed to collect over $500,000 of hryvnias, over $15,000 in 3 weeks, and with the help of the university as well. So thank you, a big thanks to you all. And just to clarify, the anti-drone gun is not an actual gun. It just emits radio frequencies, so it helps land the enemy drones. So it's not lethal, and it helps saving lives. And about this one fundraising, as for now, thanks to this conference, we have raised over 37,000 hryvnias. So thank you all, to all of you who participated. And a few words about why a quadricycle, because it's not clear for everybody. So it ensures a better mobility, it's smaller, so it is much harder to aim at it. And it will be used to carry ammunition and people directly to the front line. And in total, we need to raise around $10,000 or 400,000 hryvnias. Yes, it's pricey, but we made sure to find a really good machine in good conditions that will not have the need to be repaired every 2 weeks, because it's a problem right now in the Ukrainian army. So we make it all happen amongst the friends of Timur, amongst the university community, and we hope that we will be able with this fundraising to protect our alumni, our friends, and the armed forces of Ukraine in general. So thank you so much to everyone. And you can find all the requisites for this fundraiser in the comments for the conference, and also on the pages of Mariia Shuvalova and Oля Polykovich. Thank you.
And I would like to say thank you, our wonderful moderator, who is also part of our Kyivo-Mogilянська community, and encourage you to join our next day and its final day of our conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and see you tomorrow.